Meltdowns, meltdowns, meltdowns. This is a topic that I haven't sort of directly addressed, but you know, the world associates the word meltdown now with autism almost. And in adults with autism, Asperger's, meltdowns are complicated. They're complicated things. They sort of they're neurologically based, but I mean, meltdowns for adults can overlap with psychological factors like trauma and interpersonal frustration. There are several different causes for meltdown. There's adaptive functioning, executive functioning, sensory related stuff, and like I said, psychological. In terms of changes, stressful changes or upsetting events are difficult to process. It takes us longer to process and grasp the fact that, it something happened and we're just going to have to, somehow deal with it and, accept it and overcome. It takes us a bit long if we're also stressed out with like various other things in our life, compounding that with sensory stuff like being in a busy place, having to deal with noises, being hungry and not having eaten enough. That can definitely perpetuate meltdown. It's like a neurological processing, meltdown. The brain just can't accept and deal with and process the change, and sensory stuff doesn't help. Like I said, it compounds. You're in a busy place, especially if you don't feel well and there's a health issue that can make it someone even more prone. They say that adults have more shutdowns than meltdowns. That's usually true unless stress is high. Shutdown means that the person just has to go home and shut out social interaction and be quiet and do introspective things and kind of recharge. Meltdowns can happen if a person goes past the point where they needed to shut down and go and kind of recharge, like almost ignored their need to go do that, and then they can almost have like an outburst. It's happened to me before. I haven't been able to like escape, and I've held it to myself to try and stick it through, and I'm completely like overwhelmed and overloaded. And what happens to me, because I'm kind of a strong-willed person and I don't like to feel sort of vulnerable, is that I can get mad and I can have an outburst, and then that makes me feel terrible because I'm also a caring person, and I don't really don't like feeling cornered into basically being a bitch and reacting that way. So it's really hard. There's the temper meltdown, and there's sort of the depression meltdown. A depression meltdown is often like even less verbal. It's just like crying, and it might be because someone is really grievanced or hurt, something hurtful happened. Sometimes what can happen is, unfortunately, if you get yourself into the state of being cornered into a meltdown, a person will go through 3 stages: reacting temperamentally, depends on the personality, reacting temperamentally, or going straight to crying and covering the face. It depends on whether the person's, what their temperament is, right? If they're more of the actor Aspie type and the more conversational type, they might kind of be more temperamental at first and then go into the crying. If they're more introverted and stuff, they might go straight to the crying. Normally, it's like this initial reaction, and then there's, the emotions, and in that, sometimes it escalates so much that a person creates what you call like output, in order to divert from the overwhelmingness of the meltdown. So, this is where self-harm comes in, or even self-medicating. Unfortunately, some people have masked the fact that they do have Asperger's by developing issues with drugs and alcohol. I went through that and I barely survived that, because mine got to a point, and unfortunately, um, sometimes I blame myself for sort of triggering my health issues with that. But I mean, I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but it's easy to blame yourself. Yeah, a lot of people either resort to some sort of diversion, whether it be, you know, alcohol or pills or self harm, hitting oneself or pulling at the hair. A lot of people have a problem. I forget what it's called now. Trichotillomania. I don't know how to pronounce it. Some people with Asperger's have a problem where they pull out their hair or bite their nails like down or pinch themselves or even cut themselves. And a lot of people say, well, that's not part of like Asperger's and autism. Well, actually, it very much is, because if you think about it, people with more infantile and classic autism harm themselves. They like smack their heads against a wall or, bite themselves and things like that. So really, it is a neurological reaction. The brain is literally in a primitive mode, desperate to divert. Shutdown is always better than a meltdown. It can't always be prevented. Like, here's where psychology comes into meltdowns. You can have a psychological meltdown. Let's take a big trigger, for example, any kind of trauma trigger. For me, it's being accused of lying, being accused of manipulating and lying and making a song and dance just because of how I communicate and how I communicate with my script and the way that I sort of seem like my emotions are kind of scripted. That's just the way that I communicate. And a lot of people, like especially cynical people and people that are basically don't like me and want to hurt me, look at me through a nasty judgmental lens and say that I'm lying and accuse me of lying and accuse me of trying to get attention. And there's nothing that sort of drives me more berserk. And then I have a hard time processing it because it's like an injustice in my mind, because it's like, no, I'm not lying. Like, God damn it. Like you're just like, I'm not. And it's very frustrating. And you get into the loop of, I'm not lying. I'm not lying. It's not fair. It's not fair. Wind yourself up into the state of a meltdown, you know. So being accused of lying is a real big meltdown trigger. When you're telling the truth and you are in pain, trying to seek help, and people are not taking it seriously and saying that you're lying and exaggerating, that's a huge meltdown trigger. There's nothing more frustrating than that. Um, Another psychological meltdown trigger is just simply sort of being used to, doing something a certain way, or seeing a certain person, and they just kind of like leave you out of your life, and it feels like abandonment. Maybe they moved away and it's nothing personal, but it feels like because it's out of your routine, you can have like a meltdown over that. Those kind of things overlap with like psychological stuff and like reactive depression. um, Definitely, people with Asperger's and autism that have depression and bipolarity comorbid issues are more prone to meltdowns. And I mean full blown meltdowns. People with not as much of those issues are more going to experience the shutdowns, because the shutdowns are a softer meltdown. Um, they happen when you're less escalated, but it's still a reflection of the autistic brain saying, enough, whether it was an emotional change or an environmental change or too much sensory overload or too much social interaction. The brain just kind of shuts down. Someone might go sleep, go home and just play video games and zone out, go and have a shower, turn off their phone, shut down. And shutdowns can last, between just a day and a few days. You want to worry if a shutdown lasts for weeks on end. I mean, that might be at that point considered, more serious, more, is there an underlying physical health issue? Is there a depression, that kind of thing. That's the thing too about like mental health and Asperger's and autism, is that it overlaps a lot. People with Asperger's and autism, like I believe that autism and Asperger's are natural occurrences in themselves for sure, and that we have these natural predispositions and sensitivities to overload. I think a lot of things in our environment are inappropriate for us. The level of sensory, the what's currently in the food supply. We're reacting, and so because of this neuroinflammation, our executive functioning is further disturbed, which of course increases our chance of having meltdowns because it slows our ability to process changes, to process sensory sensitivities, to process upsetting things. Stress builds when you have a hard time getting things done that need to get done. Um, and you start chasing your tail and becoming more stressed out and getting behind and being overwhelmed and procrastinating. All those things can just pile up and produce a meltdown or a total full blown intense shutdown, of dysthymic kind of a shutdown. So Rudy Simone described that kind of process in her book Aspergirls. It's an excellent book. This is described by Dr. Tony Atwood and other pioneers in the field of autism and Asperger's. Everybody's different. The likelihood of and the frequency of meltdowns and shutdowns will depend on a person's personality, their level of stress situationally, how much support or how little support they have, their physical health. It'll depend on so many things. But you can optimize. I like to coin it in my poem Naturally Autistic. I describe it as optimizing our functionality. If our health is, it's like a well-oiled machine, our bodies are a temple, and if our health is taken care of and our stress, our ducks are in a row, we have the right supports in place, we have the right foods, the right health, a proper schedule, the ability to do the things we love and exercise our special interests and hobbies and balance that with our self-care and potentially a job or a part-time job or self-employment, um, or another sort of endeavor of purpose. If we can balance all those things, our family life, our social life, with our shutdown recharge time, all of that lessens the incidence of meltdowns. And meltdowns themselves, it's different from a shutdown. Like a shutdown's okay, a shutdown's needed, but I think that a meltdown, definitely, if a meltdown is going to happen, don't fight it. It backfires, it hurts more to fight the meltdown. Let it out. Cry, go into your room, scream into a pillow and cry, and go to sleep or whatever you need to do. Kick some rocks at the beach, at a private beach, scream on the beach if nobody is there to call on you. The frustrating thing about meltdowns too is if they happen, mental health services and people don't understand, because you've got this like person who has a high functioning form of autism, Asperger's. They can speak, they seem like they're fine, and then they have this meltdown. People tend to automatically assume that it's a mental health episode, that it's like a bipolar episode or like major depression. A meltdown is transient. Once it's sort of let out, the scream is let out, the cry is let out, the rocks are kicked, whatever, um, it it dissipates. It needs to be let out if it's going to happen. Even better than the meltdown occurring is preventative measures. But if it does happen, it happens, and sometimes it just might. And the goal is to sort of lessen the frequency, because they are hard on the body, especially if the Aspie also has fibromyalgia or Ehlers-Danlos or some other condition that can commonly occur in people on the spectrum, immune genetic health condition. Many of us have those, so meltdowns are especially hard on our bodies. Out of fear that we're gonna, be dragged into the psych ward and whatever. So many of us do that. I've done it. That's how I took up alcohol, man. I took up pills and alcohol and other, cigarettes and things that hurt me, out of fear that if I just let it out, that, I'd be dragged away by the men in the white coats. It's, it's brutal. I mean, there's nowhere for us to really go. The best thing to do definitely is to try and find the most private location you can. Um, it sucks in apartments and stuff like that, because you have neighbors, and if you're gonna scream or cry, people might be alarmed. And it sucks these days. It feels like a breach of freedom for people like us to have to internalize this crap, and I say cook. I use the word cook because it feels like you're literally cooking inside, because it's like this heat. And instead of letting it out, you're cooking your insides. And I did too much inside cooking. And because of that, I believe that it triggered my health issues a lot. I don't know if my health issues would, I think I still would have had health issues, but I do feel that it triggered them. I did a lot of internal cooking for many years, and I only was able to let it out when drunk or when alone. There are so many times where I probably should have let it out and didn't feel able, you know. And to make it worse, when I tried, I did end up in the psych ward sometimes, and it just doesn't need to be that way. So, a lot of people do a good job, though, of being able to find, um, in retrospect, being able to find places to go and ways to deal. And good on them. It's taken me many years to figure this stuff out. And a lot of people I hear their coping strategies, and they're ahead of me, in that way. Other thing is like this the I wanted to say too about the empathy factor and the love stuff that perpetuates meltdowns. Most Aspies tend to have very high empathy levels, so high that we might seem like we're blocking. And, the young lady that asked me to do this topic, meltdowns, Yvette, she was telling me about how she loves so much that it's overwhelming. And, like in the past, this kind of thing has been attributed to other, mental health stuff, but frankly, I'm certain that it's part of being an Aspie. And I know this because so many Aspies, Yvette, myself, and others say we love so much that we just don't even know what to do, and this causes us to shut down. And this perpetuates meltdowns as well because we're so sensitive. Like Yvette was saying, the phrase "I love you" just doesn't cut it. And that's true. I mean, I care so much about, injustice and like especially social injustice. It's when I hear people being treated structurally violently and unfairly, and being denied of their rights and their basic needs, it's painful to me. It just makes me want to scream, and the way that I channel that is through my blogging and through my writing, and I need to do more of it in my music and poetry, because that's an even more alleviating outlet for me. So, I mean, those things are great to prevent meltdowns. Definitely the arts, music and poetry and visual art. Those are all great things, but I just wanted to acknowledge what Yvette said about the love thing. It is. I think a lot of us love intensely and passionately, and but we tend to block and shut down because we're afraid of that rejection, that when we love so much, it's too much for people and people push us away, and it hurts. So we tend to overly guard after a while and internalize that, and that can all perpetuate meltdown. So executive functioning, getting behind an organization, being overwhelmed with stuff that needs to get done, sensory, so busy places, lights, sound, not feeling well, changes, people misunderstanding you. All of those things are hard to process, and all of those things contribute to meltdowns. So it's about having wind down time, artistic outlets, special interests, peer support, good counseling, perhaps from a counselor that gets Asperger's syndrome, all of that. And if a meltdown is going to happen, trying to find an outlet, some place to let it out. And worse comes to worse, if you can't find that place, perhaps writing a song or a poem or painting a picture or just going into your room, curling up into a ball and crying is enough. And I think that all of this can be, I mean, I think even people who don't have Asperger's and autism and experience anxiety and OCD and depression and trauma can, you know, take a leaf out of the same book in that way and use similar measures to help themselves. Um, these things are all overlap: neurological, psychological, executive functioning, sensorial. So Yeah, that's my fluid video on meltdowns.